this paper, there's a lot of papers about how to write a scientific paper. And I started looking through a few of them, and I liked some of them and I didn't like others, or it didn't have things I thought it should have. And the background for this was partly motivated by the paper that Laura's working on, which is not, I would say, a fully scientific paper because it's a paper about citizen science, but it's much more in the science realm than what she's used to, which is in the history realm. And so, you know, this kind of goes through like, what is a science paper? And I thought that would be useful for other folks. I think it's useful for me as well. You know, you can always get tips, and writing science papers is difficult. So, you know, I think this also kind of gives you some good background from the science perspective, Tyler, of, you know, what people are doing when they're writing science papers and how that differs from what you do in the communication of science in different ways. So yeah, so I wanted to kind of go through it, and we probably won't get through it today, but in the style that we've done the past reads, we've just kind of people have read out loud different sections, and then provided some, well, either I provide some like, here's what I think is the key part of this, or ask questions about what's in it. So let's try that. And does anybody want to read the first like 2 paragraphs here?
I can go for it.
Good wait time, Liz.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Go for it, Tyler.
Scientific papers are for sharing your own original research work with other scientists or for reviewing the research conducted by others. As such, they are critical to the evolution of modern science, in which the work of one scientist builds upon that of others. To reach their goal, papers must aim to inform, not impress. They must be highly readable, that is, clear, accurate, and concise. They are more likely to be cited by other scientists if they are helpful rather than cryptic or self-centered. Scientific papers typically have 2 audiences. First, the referees, who help the journal editor decide whether a paper is suitable for publication, and second, the journal readers themselves, who may be more or less knowledgeable about the topic addressed in the paper. To be accepted by referees and cited by readers, papers must do more than simply present a chronological account of the research work. Rather, they must convince their audience that the research presented is important, valid, and relevant to other scientists in the same field. To this end, they must emphasize both the motivation for the work and the outcome of it, and they must include just enough evidence to establish the validity of this outcome.
All right, that sounds great. Laura, what did you think of this? Does this help?
Kind of. I think what I'm kind of struggling with in terms of the style is the proportion of persuasive writing and the proportion of informative writing.
Yeah, and you're tending to overemphasize the persuasive a bit, I think. So I noticed that the one word here you bolded that I didn't bold was convince.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have bolded convince, because you are just flatly presenting stuff that is supposed to be, you know, you are trying to convince someone that something is important, valid, and relevant, but without any, the big thing here is that this is not a term paper. You're not meant to impress anyone. So, you know, this is, as opposed to like Vince, if you're writing a paper for your professor, you want to put in all the things that show you learned all the things. You're kind of trying to impress that professor. That's the audience of that paper. A science paper, that is not your audience, and that is not what you're trying to do. You're trying to like build upon the body of knowledge, and you're trying to show why what you've done is helpful. Okay. And the science part of it is often very technical, detailed, you know, there's a meaty part to it. And that's why the other parts around it are aimed at you know, how can this be as concise and clear as possible? So, but you don't have to push an agenda specifically. So you are trying to do more than present just, we did this and this and this. You're trying to present what it means.
So what they mean then by convince is not present a persuasive argument, but rather contextualize.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that makes
So
sense.
yeah, I would, that's the in your case, don't jump on the word convince, like interpret it more as contextualize.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else want to have any questions or feedback on just those 2 paragraphs?
I guess the thing for me that stood out was clear, accurate, and concise. And that's definitely the hardest thing with me in writing, is that I mean, I try and be concise, but a lot of the times the biggest thing is when I reread it, I take out stuff that, you know, is redundant, or like I say it more than once. And that's the big thing, is that even though you might want to repeat it more than once for like a blog article or like a video or something like that, like a script. In a scientific paper, you don't really want to do that, from my experience, because you're expecting that somebody is gonna read it and they're gonna understand.
You don't want it to be any longer than necessary, and then each part has a specific structure, so that's kind of why. And I think as we get into it, we'll see. Yeah, so this was also interesting for me. Like this last week, Andy wrote an abstract, and you know, he kind of very much started with like a blog tone, and then you know, I was kind of like, no, you know, you're kind of going for more of just presenting in an abstract what you did, why you did it, what you're going to present, and he definitely shifted it and got there. But it's very different than how, like, I kind of think we all have natural writing styles, or styles that we're more familiar with, and this is it can be not natural to most people. I don't feel like it's natural to me. I've worked with other people who can really like crank out science papers and like fully, that's a real skill to have. So yeah.
This is very helpful, because when you're writing in history, because you're right that most of the content that you're writing about are not things that are absolute in any way. It's more sort of interpretation. The purpose of a history paper is to persuade people to take up a thesis, or to challenge the thesis so that it ultimately advances the field. But it's to persuade people to engage in a conversation, and that is a very different goal than this kind of writing. And that's really good to note, because again, one of the things that I'm finding coming into this field is that there's a lot of things that we use the same words to refer to, but that are actually quite distinct. And exactly like convince. So for convince for me means, oh, there's a thesis and I have to persuade you to my thesis. That's a very different thing from what you're talking about here. So there's a lot of false cognates, Tyler, in particular, to be aware of, that I'm starting to notice.
Mm-hmm. All right. Vince, do you want to read the next part here?
Sure, I'll read down to although. That works. Papers that report experimental work are often structured chronologically in 5 sections. First, introduction, then materials and methods, results, and discussion. Together, these 3 sections make up the paper's body, and finally, conclusion. The introduction section clarifies the motivation for the work presented and prepares readers for the structure of the paper. The materials and methods section provides sufficient detail for other scientists to reproduce the experiments presented in the paper. In some journals, this information is placed in an appendix because it is not what most readers want to know first. The results and discussion sections present and discuss the research results, respectively. They are often usefully combined into one section. However, because readers can seldom make sense of results alone without accompanying interpretation, they need to be told what the results mean. The conclusion section presents the outcome of the work by interpreting the findings at a higher level of abstraction than the discussion, and by relating these findings to the motivations stated in the introduction. Papers reporting something other than experiments, such as new method or technology, typically have different sections in their body, but they will include the same introduction and conclusion sections as described above.
Why don't you keep going?
Sure. Although the above structure reflects the progression of most research projects, effective papers typically break the chronology in at least 3 ways to present their content in the order in which the audience will most likely want to read it. First and foremost, they summarize the motivation for and the outcome of the work in an abstract located before the introduction. In a sense, they reveal the beginning and end of the story briefly before providing the full story. Second, they move the more detailed, less important parts of the body to the end of the paper in 1 or more appendices, so that these parts do not stand in the reader's way. Finally, they structure the content in the body in theorem-proof fashion, stating first what readers must remember, for example, as the first sentence of a paragraph, and then presenting evidence to support the statement.
It's been a long time since I did theorem proof.
Yeah, and I would say really that's kind of it's because these kind of paragraphs can get really dense. So it's really important to and because you yourself can what am I trying to say in this paragraph? So it's really important to, and this is important in other kinds of writing too, but to have that first sentence be a key sentence of this paragraph, I'm presenting this, and then here's what the paragraph is about. So the rest of this article goes into more details on the sections. So we don't need to kind of worry too much about, or we're going to learn more about them as we go. The only kind of thing I wanted to point out with this is that the sections do vary. And so materials and methods is not what it's often called in space physics papers, but that's okay. Most of there's still a section where you say what you did. So you will see different sections, and that's all right. But I think, especially because this is also a nature guide, it somehow, when the nature papers are especially concise and high impact, but it's got some good tips about how to make a high impact paper that I think apply to all kinds of papers, because because you always want to present it as clearly as possible. And personally, I don't necessarily feel like this structure that science as a whole has is necessarily the easiest way to present or write, but it is kind of what's expected. And when people read, they often jump around to different sections because of this. So, all right. Any other comments on that?
I guess the only thing I have to say is that a lot of the times in the papers I see, there's also an observations section. If they have observations, they'll include that in a separate thing sometimes.
I think
so.
One of the things that's difficult for me to comprehend, and I think I had made a note about it, but I think we'll go into that more as we go further, is where the different sections overlap and where they are distinct. One of the things that I've struggled with this paper that I'm writing is what to put in the discussion, what to put in the conclusion, because there seems to be a fair amount of overlap between those two sections. So I'm looking forward to figuring out a little bit more about what makes what thematically makes each section unique. Because a lot of it sounds synonymous to me.
Right, and some of it, like what Vince just said, is that you can have some results in the observations section. But what I would say to that is so the observation section is kind of replacing that materials and methods in a typical space physics paper, but that's meant to show here are the data, and then results are more here's what we did to the data, here's more of the sciencing we did on the data, and then the discussion is more here's what that means, and then the conclusion is here's overall what it means.
Okay.
Here's the big picture of what it means. So in that example, it's a little bit more clear, but papers get put together in different ways. And our paper that we're working on, Laura, it's kind of gotten put together as here's one use case, here's another use case, here's another use case. What does this all mean? And that's sort of the reason why it's a little different. But I think thinking about, you know, some of this structure, I think will help.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
All right. Do you want to read on the introduction section, Laura, here?
Certainly. An effective introduction for a paper. The introduction reproduced here, which you can see a little bit better at the actual link, exhibits the 4 components that readers find useful as they begin to read a paper. In the introduction section, state the motivation for the work presented in your paper and prepare readers for the structure of the paper. Write 4 components, probably, but not necessarily, in 4 paragraphs: context, need, task, and object of the document. First, provide some context to orient those readers who are less familiar with your topic and establish the importance of the work. Is that also like historiography? Is that the part where like who's talked about it before goes?
Lots of citations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Second, state the need for your work as an opposition between what the scientific community currently has and what it wants. That's very similar to grants. Third, indicate what you have done in an effort to address the need. This is the task. Finally, preview the remainder of the paper to mentally prepare readers for its structure in the object of the document. Context and need. At the beginning of the introduction section, the context and need, work together as a funnel. They start broad and progressively narrow down the issue addressed in the paper. To spark interest among your audience, referees and journal readers alike, provide a compelling motivation for the work presented in your paper. The fact that a phenomenon has never been studied before is not in itself a reason to study that phenomenon. Write the context in a way that appeals to a broad range of readers and leads into the need. Do not include context for the sake of including context. Rather, provide only what will help readers better understand the need and especially its importance. Consider anchoring the context in time using phrases such as recently, in the past 10 years, or since the early 1990s. You may also want to anchor your context in space, either geographically or within a given research field. Convey the need for the work as an opposition between actual and desired situations. Start by stating the actual situation, what we have, as a direct continuation of the context. If you feel you must explain recent achievements in much detail, say in more than 1 or 2 paragraphs, consider moving the details to a section titled State of the Art or something similar after the introduction, but do provide a brief idea of the actual situation in the introduction. Next, state the desired situation, what we want. Emphasize the contrast between the actual and desired situations with such words as but, however, or unfortunately. One elegant way to express the desired part of the need is to combine it with the task in a single sentence. The sentence expresses first the objective, then the action undertaken to reach this objective, thus creating a strong and elegant connection between need and task. Excuse me. I always do this when I read out loud. Here are 3 examples of such a combination. To confirm this assumption, we studied the effects of a range of inhibitors of connexin channels on. To assess whether such multiple coil sensors perform better than single signal ones, we tested 2 of them, the Duo PXK and the GEM-MEM3, in a field where, to form a better view of the global distribution and infectiousness of this pathogen, we examined 1645 post-metamorphic and adult amphibians collected from 27 countries between 1984 and 2006 for the presence of.
Let's quit there for a sec. Yeah, cool. Those examples are extremely technical, but they make me think of our paper. You know, in our paper, you know, we have a thing called the Scientific Products Inventory that we are assessing for 3 different citizen science projects. And so we're assessing whether it's useful or how it can be used. And you know, that hasn't been done before. And it's also being done in order to tackle the question of how you track metrics for citizen science projects and how you can track them across different projects. So that's what we're trying to get out of that. But yeah, I think those examples can parallel to our topic, Laura.
Definitely.
Any other thoughts on this?
Kind of going back, as far as results in discussion, are they separate sections or is it just considered one?
They can be, but they're going to talk about that like later on in this article. So yeah, you can skip ahead if you want, but yeah, I know some of this probably is like less relevant for you, Tyler, but yeah, it's all kind of interesting. So yeah, hopefully.
They kind of structured this article in a way that models what the paper should look like.
Yeah, so they're going through each section now, but they didn't actually tell us that's how they were going to do it, which is what they recommended that you do. So we're still in depth in the introduction, because and the other context, I don't know how many nature papers you guys have read, but a nature paper is like the top kind of science paper, and it's really short, and so you really have to take out all of the extraneous parts and keep it readable for this broad audience, and like really write a high quality paper, which is kind of why their suggestions here I feel like are pretty useful, because it's useful just in general. Okay, let me keep going, and we can, we'll probably only go till about 10 o'clock today, but then we can finish this another time as well. Task and object. An introduction is usually clearer and more logical when it separates what the authors have done, the task, from what the paper itself attempts or covers, the object of the document. In other words, the task clarifies your contribution as a scientist, whereas the object of the document prepares readers for the structure of the paper, thus allowing focused or selective reading. For the task, use whoever did the work, normally you and your colleagues, as the subject of the sentence. We, or perhaps the authors. Use a verb expressing a research action, what we actually did, measured, calculated, etc. Set that verb in the past tense. The three examples below are well-formed tasks. To confirm this assumption, we studied the effects of a range of inhibitors of connexin channels, blah, blah, blah. During controlled experiments, we investigated the influence of the HMP boundary conditions on liver flows. To tackle this problem, we developed a new software verification technique called oblivious hashing. The list below provides examples of verbs that express research actions. Apply, assess, calculate, compare, compute, derive, design, determine, develop, evaluate, explore, implement, investigate, measure, model. So all of those are, yeah, good examples. I'm trying to think of our paper, Laura. We kind of applied the scientific products inventory, one of the more appropriate ones for our paper. And as a result, we developed, some extensions.
This is great to get the buzzwords in there.
Investigated its utility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This feels more template-y than most papers that I've written before. Is that a fair thing to say, that it's a template so that people can read it more quickly?
It's a template because it's at such a high level, because they see so many of these that have so much crap thrown in them that when you see a lot of them, you don't want the fluff. You don't want the other bits. And so they're trying to make the template, for their own purpose and partly, but it is helpful. And like, I don't know, in our case, we're already pretty far into the paper, and this is providing some like global context.
Right.
But if we were writing a paper about Steve or a paper about Nodak or something like this, and we're trying to organize it, it's really helpful. Like, so, you know, you picture somebody like Michael Hunnicle, he's got like all this stuff, and like, how do we, where is the paper, where is the result? In order to present a paper, publish a paper on that work, you have to effectively kind of funnel it into something like a template so that others can be following it. And so that those like key results are like rising to the top.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Let's see. I'm gonna keep reading this section, I think. 3 examples below are suitable objects of the document for the 3 tasks shown above. So first you say, we did this, we explored this, blah, blah, blah. And then you say, this paper overall clarifies the role of something on something else in some other realm, blah, 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 HeLa cells. Yeah, very technical. This paper presents the flow effects induced by increasing the hepatic artery pressure and by obstructing the vena cava inferior. This paper discusses the theory behind oblivious hashing and shows how this approach can be applied for local software, tamper resistance, and remote code authentication. That one seems most applicable to our paper, Laura. So this, I'm going to highlight it even. This paper discusses the use of the scientific products inventory in 3 cases and shows how this approach, shows how this approach can be applied across projects and for deeper evaluation insights, something like that.
Yeah.
Examples of verbs that express communication actions: clarify, describe, detail, discuss, explain, offer, present, propose, provide, report, summarize. Cool. And I think, are we still talking about the end of the body section here? Or this body section, I think, is at the end of the introduction. Let me.
This is the next section.
No, I think it's still at the end of the introduction that they're talking about.
Yeah, looks like it's still end of intro.
Yeah.
I see, like advanced organizer. Do we want to give Tyler a chance?
Yes, sure. Yeah, Tyler, do you want to read this next little section called the body here?
Yeah, I can. Even the most logical structure is of little use if readers do not see and understand it as they progress through a paper. Thus, as you organize the body of your paper into sections and perhaps subsections, remember to prepare your readers for the structure ahead at all levels. You already do so for the overall structure of the body, the sections, and the object of the document at the end of the introduction. You can similarly prepare your readers for an upcoming division into subsections by introducing a global paragraph between the heading of a section and the heading of its first subsection. This paragraph can contain any information relating to this section as a whole rather than particular subsections, but it should at least announce the subsections, whether explicitly or implicitly. Yeah, an explicit preview would be phrased much like the object of the document. This section first, then, and finally. Although papers can be organized into sections in many ways, those reporting experimental work typically include materials and methods, results, and discussion in their body. In any case, the paragraphs in these sections should begin with a topic sentence to prepare readers for their content, allow selective reading, and ideally get a message across.
Very cool. This is a little bit of an abstract sort of paragraph here, but one place it could be useful is, like this paper we're writing, Laura, we have an introduction section. We're going to say what we do. And then in the effectively materials and methods section, we're going to have 3 use cases. And so I think what it's kind of saying is that you could have a paragraph above the 3 use cases that talks about how what we've presented, or the common structure of those 3 use cases, so that there's kind of a transition paragraph there that helps the reader. That's one example I can think of for that. But if this seems very abstract, don't worry about it. Will eventually, you'll see it, or it will it will be useful.
It honestly feels more linear, concrete than I was thinking, but I like that this is really helping me kind of get a feel for what it should feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we got 5 more minutes here. Should we delve into the start of the materials and methods? Why not? All right, go for it, Vince.
All right, materials and methods. A paragraph of materials and methods. There it is. This paragraph of materials and methods expresses the main idea first in a topic sentence, so readers immediately know what it is about. Most materials and methods sections are boring to read, yet they need not be. To make this section interesting, explain the choices you made in your experimental procedure. What justifies using a given compound, concentration, or dimension? What is special, unexpected, or different in your approach? Mention these things early in your paragraph, ideally in the first sentence. If you use a standard or usual procedure, mention that up front too. Don't make readers guess. Make sure the paragraph's first sentence gives them a clear idea of what the entire paragraph is about. If you feel you cannot or need not do more than the list items, consider using a table or perhaps a schematic diagram rather than a paragraph of text.
Yeah, so in that case, there could be something really technical and you need to a table about what you did that you can just refer back to. Oh, all right, we're almost through this
Yeah,
thing.
I was looking at that too. One thing about the, a question I had a few sections ago is it okay to sort of switch tenses in a paper, or do you all want to keep it the same verb tense? Because I have trouble, like I'm writing a paper right now and I say, we observed a small section of this, data set, or we observed a small section of the sun. And then in these data, we note and we describe, as in like talking about the paper. So like, that's like one thing that I have a hard time with, especially.
I would say that it's probably, in that example you just gave, probably best to keep it all in the past tense.
Yeah.
As in, we did the thing, here are the results.
Yeah.
So we noted.
Okay. That's what I thought too, because I was looking at my own paper and I'm like, oh, I need to switch that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I don't know if it talks more about tense later when you're talking about like what could be coming up, because they're what you haven't done. Yeah. There's a lot of lots of grammar.
Yeah, that's always been hard for me, is the verb tense.
So, and that's just a minor thing, but it's not going to get your paper rejected, but it's good to think about and try and fix as you're going if you can. All right. Results and discussion and conclusion. Should we kind of try to push through here or what?
Yeah, let's do it. If that's all right with you. If you guys have a couple of minutes, let's pull through.
Okay. Laura, do you want to read the results here?
Results and discussion. A paragraph of results and discussion. Oh my God, this happens every time I read to Shauna all the time. About 5 beats after I start reading out loud. I don't know why. The traditional results and discussion sections are best combined because results make little sense to most readers without interpretation. When reporting and discussing your results, do not force your readers to go through everything you went to in chronological order. Instead, state the message of each paragraph up front. Convey in the first sentence what you want readers to remember from the paragraph as a whole. Focus on what happened, not on the fact that you observed it. That's interesting. Then develop your message in the remainder of the paragraph, including only that information you think you need to convince your audience. Liz, can you elaborate a little more on this sentence? What's the difference between what happened and what you observed? Or the fact that you observed it?
Well, they're saying that just the fact that you observed it does not mean that it's important.
Okay.
So, like, people tend to be, there's a lot of ego that goes into, we saw this first thing. And nature is basically telling you here that they're not impressed by just the fact that you saw that first thing, unless you've got all of this other stuff going on. And one thing I liked about this results and discussion, this tip here, is that they are basically saying that they should be combined. And I like that because, and they have a reason, because, you know, the discussion is where you're interpreting your results. And I feel like it just does make a lot more sense to try and combine those sections than have, personally, I always interpret things as I go. So the having a separate section of interpretation is difficult to me, most cases. And then the other thing that's important, another thing that's important is not, it's going to be a very different order of what's significant in the end compared to the order in which you went through all the things. So, you know, Vince, like what you did in that internship and the different things you tried, it's really only the key results that are the most important to be presenting, how you got to them. In grad school as well, like you might spend years doing stuff, but you're like working through a maze, and it's the pathways that, mostly the pathways that worked, that got you where you're trying to present, that will be presented. Sometimes it is important to talk about what didn't work, but people tend to not do that as much. And especially the chronological order, that makes it too kind of muddled to figure out the significance. So, all right, let's see. So they do, you know, they do talk about a little bit persuasive here, develop your message in the remainder of the paragraph. But in this case, the message is based on interpreting results. So it's based on data and what you did to that data. It's not just, so, you know, I guess in history as well, there's a persuasive argument that's backed up, but you don't, they say include only the information you think you need to convince your audience. I'm not sure entirely what that means. I think it means don't go overboard, and don't yeah, and stick to the message. That's kind of what it means. But from the perspective of, there's some science that is the key, that your takeaway that you're trying to show and demonstrate. Okay, an effective conclusion from a paper. This paragraph of results and discussion above can easily be rewritten below to convey the message first, not last. I'm not sure what that means. In the conclusion section, state the most important outcome of your work. Do not simply summarize the points already made. Instead, interpret your findings at a higher level of abstraction. So kind of more the big picture. Show whether or to what extent you have succeeded in addressing the need stated in the introduction. At the same time, don't focus on yourself. Don't repeat everything you did, but show what your findings mean to readers. Make the conclusion interesting and memorable for them. At the end of your conclusion, consider including perspectives, that is, an idea of what could or should still be done in relation to the issue addressed in the paper. If you include perspectives, Clarify whether you are referring to firm plans for yourself and your colleagues. In the coming months, we will do this, or an invitation to readers. One remaining question is this. If your paper includes a well-structured introduction and an effective abstract, you need not repeat any of the introduction in the conclusion. In particular, do not restate what you have done or what the paper does. Instead, focus on what you have found, and especially on what your results mean. Don't be afraid to write a short conclusion section. If you can conclude in just a few sentences, given the rich discussion in the body of the paper, then do so. In other words, resist the temptation to repeat material from the introduction just to make the conclusion longer, under the false belief that a longer conclusion will seem more impressive. That is nature speaking to the scientists who are trying to get the paper in their journal. Yeah.
When they say,
Go ahead.
when they say a higher level of abstraction, can you elaborate a little bit on what that means? Like what
I think they tried to describe what it meant.
they did, but it still sounds pretty similar to the discussion for me. Can you?
It's more. So I would say, if you do the rest of what they said here, you will be achieving the higher level of abstraction.
Is it like a broader societal level contextualization as opposed to a specific topical contextualization? Is that what they mean? Or
yeah, I think they're saying kind of zoom back out to the 10,000 foot level.
Great.
Yeah.
cool.
It's hard to read this in sort of in the abstract sense. So, all right, we got just the abstract, notably last here. Tyler, could you read some of the abstract section here again?
I think he had to go for a phone call. I can read
Okay.
it.
Sorry, Tyler. Thank you.
Hey, y'all, I'm back.
Oh,
Oh,
Sorry
no,
about
that's
that.
okay. We're
Thank you for
appreciate
joining
you
us.
putting us in.
You want me to read the abstract? Or-
Yeah, an effective abstract.
Okay. In just under 200 words, the abstract reproduced here conveys the motivation for the outcome of the work with some accuracy, but without intimidating readers by its length. The readers of a scientific paper read the abstract for two purposes: to decide whether they want to acquire and read the full paper, and to prepare themselves for the details presented in that paper. An effective abstract helps readers achieve these two purposes. In particular, because it is typically read before the full paper, the abstract should present what the readers are primarily interested in. That is, what they want to know first of all and most of all. Typically, readers are primarily interested in the information presented in a paper's introduction and conclusion sections. Primarily, they want to know the motivation for the work presented and the outcome of this work. Then and only then, the most specialized among them might want to know the details of the work. Thus, an effective abstract focuses on motivation and outcome. In doing so, it parallels the paper's introduction and conclusion. Accordingly, you can think of an abstract as having two distinct parts: motivation and outcome. Even if it's typeset as a single paragraph, for the first part, follow the same structure as the introduction section of the paper. State the context, the need, the task, and the object of the document. For the second part, mention your findings, the what, and especially your conclusion, the so what. That is the interpretation of your findings. If appropriate, inward perspectives as the conclusion section of your paper. Although the structure of the abstract parallels the introduction and conclusion sections, it differs from these sections in the audience it addresses. The abstract is read by many different readers, from the most specialized to the least specialized among the target audience. In a sense, it should be the least specialized part of the paper. Any scientist reading it should be able to understand why the work was carried out and why it is important, context, and need. What the authors did, task, and what the paper reports about this work, object of the document. What the authors found, findings. what these findings mean, the conclusion, and possibly what the next steps are, perspectives. In contrast, the full paper is typically read by specialists only. Its introduction and conclusion are more detailed, that is longer and more specialized than the abstract. An effective abstract stands on its own. It can be understood fully even when made available without the full paper. To this end, avoid referring to figures or the bibliography in the abstract. Also, introduce any acronyms the first time you use them in the abstract if needed, and do so again in the full paper. See mechanics using abbreviations.
Cool. All right, does this help with any of the mysterious amounts of, what is an abstract? An abstract is less abstract now, that's what I'm trying to say.
I love it. So what is the difference between, and this is really just like, and I've seen this in registering for AGU, what is the difference between a abstract and a plain language summary? Should an abstract be more plain language, or should it maintain the same technical language?
Well, there's also a difference between the abstract for a conference and the abstract for a paper.
Oh, okay.
So what you're asking is, what's the difference at AGU between the abstract for your presentation and a plain language summary?
Yeah.
So in this case, I think this definition of an abstract for a paper is a pretty useful, it mostly translates to the conference version, except for the conference version, you'd add more about what you present at the conference. A plain language summary is a new thing, just happened in the last few years, about really presented at the non-scientist level.
Okay.
So if you would really, like the societal level, whereas at an AGU conference, and even for the Nature Journal, you're gonna assume those readers are scientists or peers.
Okay.
So all of this that we're talking about for the abstract, even though it said it's the least specialized, least specialized meaning anyone who reads Nature could read it.
Okay.
That does not mean plain language for anyone at AGU in a different field. It's plain language is a little more, even more, less jargony.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay, so jargon is still acceptable in that sense.
they're telling you to avoid jargon, but it can be a pretty, you can have a lot of
I could say magnetosphere.
fancy words. Yeah. You can use the fancy words. So
Cool. This is really helpful. Thank you, Liz, for doing this. This is great.